Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. There are still some empty ones, so if you're still standing, you can find your space. We're going to be starting shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on the second day of the Warsaw Security Forum. My name is Maja Mazurkiewicz. I'm the host of the TV show Anatomy of Disinformation at the TVP World, and I will be holding space for you today at the Brussels stage. And we have very, very exciting discussions all over the day, but we're kicking off with a very, very special conversation on the future of European and global security economics. And as we all know, the security is not only about tanks and bots, but it's very much about economics and tariffs and what we as the citizens also feel as the security in our housing and our economics. And we are having very, very special guests. And please join me in welcoming Mr. Andrzej Domański, Minister of Finance and Economy of Poland, and Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, Minister of Finance of Norway, Secretary General of NATO from 2014 until 2024, and already Maria Tadeo, the European correspondent of the La Grande Continent that is holding the conversation, is here.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
We have strictly 20 minutes because the minister is very busy, so I'm going to start and get on with it. I had a different question to begin with, but I want to ask you, there's been some interesting developments over the past 24 hours about what to do with the Russian frozen assets. That is going to be debated tomorrow by European leaders. The German chancellor put out an op-ed in the Financial Times suggesting we should use them, and there's this idea of a reparation loan. So should that happen?
Well, good morning, everyone, and I'm really happy that I'm here with you today. The importance of this event is higher and higher, so really happy to be here. So coming to your question, the Polish position here was always very, very clear. Aggressor must pay. Russia must pay. We have billions of Russian frozen assets, and it's our job to use those to rebuild Ukraine. And it was the Polish position from the very beginning. Then, of course, some countries were presenting some arguments against, but it looks like European Commission managed to present a solution that will both enable using those assets for Ukraine now, and at the same time will calm down some legal disputes about frozen Russian assets.
So you say we supported, and in fact we did from the beginning?
Yes, we did.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Stoltenberg, I was just about to call you Secretary General again. This was going to kick in. I know you have prepared some remarks, so maybe you want to, or maybe we should just go straight in ahead. That's perfect. In a way, you're the perfect person to speak to in a panel like this because you know defense very well, and now you handle finance. One of the things that we've heard repeatedly in this conference from a lot of executives who sell weapons, that's their business, they say it's great to talk to the defense ministers, but we should be talking to the finance ministers because they have the money. They have to be in the room. What synergies do you see between finance and defense?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be back in Warsaw. I've been in Warsaw many, many times over the last decade, but then, as you said, in the capacity as Secretary General of NATO. Now I'm here as a relatively newly appointed Minister of Finance in Norway. And to be honest, I'm very surprised that I ended up there, but it's a challenge. And as you said, there are actually many strong links between defense and finance for many reasons. Partly because I think we need to understand that a vibrant and strong economy is a precondition for safe and secure societies. And I think if you just briefly look back, the reason why NATO won the Cold War was not because we fought the hot war on the battlefield, but it was because our economies were stronger, more competitive than the economy of the Soviet Union. So they couldn't afford to continue the Cold War, and therefore the Soviet Union was dissolved, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and NATO prevailed after the Cold War because of strong economies, innovative, dynamic economies. So economy, prerequisite for strong societies, safe societies. Second, we see how economic tools are now used to coerce NATO countries. The most blunt example is, of course, Russia using gas after full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We should not put ourselves in the same situation with China, where we become too vulnerable to depend on their rare earth minerals or Chinese technology. So economy matters. We should not become vulnerable for coercion. And thirdly, strong economies is what we need to finance defense. And the minister, Andrzej, and I, we just discussed the challenge that more and more NATO allies now pay more in interests on the debt, government debt, than they pay for defense. So borrowing in the long run is not sustainable. Strong economies, high growth is the way to finance strong defense. So Minister of Finance, very important for defense.
Very good. That's a perfect segue now. Perhaps, Minister, a question to you. Mr. Stoltenberg just said something very interesting. You can't just borrow ad infinitum to finance defense. In the European Union, as you know, there's a big debate as to what is a funding question. A lot of ideas have been presented. The SAVE, the EDIP. There's now this question of the national budgets are going to have to carry it. But there's also the idea that joint debt could be present. The European Union did it in the pandemic, and that worked well, seemingly. So is that something that you say we need to have that conversation? Joint debt is something that we should put on the table?
Well, security is a common good. Therefore, we should look for a common answer, common reply, how to provide it in Europe. So we are happy that we have SAFE already, and the Poland being the biggest beneficiary of that, up to 43 billion euro. Then, of course, you need to finance it from the state budget, and this is why we are kindly asking our European friends to spend more on defense. And we see that it's country by country, there are more and more declarations of increasing spending on defense, and it's very, very good. Then, on common borrowing. Well, we know that we need a consensus here, and there are some countries, important countries in Europe, who are strongly against.
Germany said no.
Having said that, our duty is always think about that and always argue in favor of that. So this is that's our position. And frankly, while looking at a new European budget, we see that the spending on dual use, on broadly understood defense, are increasing. So we see that the European Commission is sharing our position, And with our discussion with Commission, we are really optimistic about the future.
And Poland was also very successful in pitching the idea that there should be an exemption of the 3% deficit too while your presidency. But I wonder, the Greek Prime Minister said the other day, this is a delicate debate. The question of debt triggers big emotions in the EU. But he did say, my impression is that support is increasing, not decreasing. Is that something that you feel too when you sit around the table?
First of all, about fiscal rules of EU. Well, we do like, of course, the general escape clause that allows us to spend more. Having said that, as a Minister of Finance, I need to say, debt is debt. Deficit is deficit. At the end of the day, I need to borrow those money and one day pay it back. So just please understand that there are, of course, limits. There are limits. Then on buying together, I believe that maybe, of course, we are emphasizing how much we spend, and we are proud, close to 5% of our GDP. Having said that, it's maybe even more important how we spend those money, whether we are really spending those money in a way that it's helping strengthen our European economy. For me, it's very crucial to spend each zloty, each euro in a way that strengthens European economy, that creates jobs in Poland, in European Union. That's also not only the question about economy, also about the long-term security of our continent.
And you think support is increasing? Would you also share that? The Greeks said, we believe this debate, support for debt, joint debt, has increased, has not decreased.
For sure.
So you feel that too. Mr. Minister Stoltenberg, one of the things, again, yesterday we were here for day one, there's been sort of idea that we should not confuse European defense with just EU defense. These are two separate things, but they should also run in tandem. You are a European country, but you're not a member of the EU. How do you see this constellation of European defense, and do you share the idea that it goes beyond the EU? It's really the entire continent.
I think the EU has a very important role to play to help to strengthen European defense, not least by strengthening European defense industry. The fragmentation of the European defense industry is a huge obstacle to reduce costs, to utilize the economy of scale, and also for innovation, and also help to push up defense spending among European allies. But Europe is not the European Union. Europe goes beyond the European Union. There are roughly 450 million people living in the European Union. In NATO allied countries, which are European, also the European NATO allies, that's 600 million people. Much more than, so actually there are more Europeans in NATO than there are Europeans in the European Union. Because we have countries like the United Kingdom, Turkey, Norway, and others. So we just have to understand that the EU is very important, and I am strongly in favor of the EU. I tried to convince the Norwegian people to join the European Union in a big referendum back in '94. We lost, but I believe in the European Union. But the European Union cannot replace NATO for European security, partly because of the fact that there are more Europeans in NATO than there are in the EU, but also because if you look at NATO's total defense expenditure, 80% of NATO's total defense expenditure comes from non-EU allies. Meaning, again, of course, the United States, but also Canada, United Kingdom, and many others. And thirdly, if you look at the geography, you see in the south, you have Turkey. Turkey is critical for the southern flank, for the fight against ISIS, extremely important for European security. In the north, you have countries like Norway and Iceland, not very big, but extremely important for the transatlantic link to protect the North Atlantic. And then you have, in the west, of course, you have the United States, Canada, but also the United Kingdom. So people, 600 million versus 450 million. Money, 80% versus 20% of total defense expenditure. And geography, all of this makes it obvious that the EU is important, but NATO is the framework to protect Europe.
And do you believe, however, in the EU program specifically, there's measures like the SAFE, more things could come in. Do you want to see further integration? Do you want the EU to treat third countries like yours not just like a close partner, but really fully integrated? And since you mentioned joining the EU, some believe if you want integration, the best way is to just join the EU. Is that something that you believe could start again at the common imagination? Some believe the Nordics, maybe defense can trigger enlargement in a way.
Well, also, I believe that the best way to integrate with the European Union is to join the European Union. But the problem is that you have democracies and the people decide. And in the United Kingdom, people disagreed and they voted to leave. And in Norway, we tried. Also, Norway is the only country in the world that has negotiated an accession treaty with the European Union not only once but twice, in '72 and in '94. And then the Norwegian people have voted it down twice. And I have been on the losing side twice. So yes, I agree with you, but then help me to convince the Norwegian people or the British people or all the others. So I think we just have to face the fact that big European countries like Norway, Iceland, but also United Kingdom and others, remain outside the European Union, like it or not. And then we need to find ways to work together, and we do that, and there are many of the EU programs which are open, which integrate Norway and other countries outside the European Union, United Kingdom, but there are also some of the programs where I'm a bit afraid that there are dangers of creating new barriers between EU members and non-EU members of NATO. That's not good, because you need to utilize the full capacity of our transatlantic economy, both to make it dynamic, prosperous, and that's also the reason why I'm concerned about the tariffs which the US is imposing on European goods, but also concerned about any measures from the European Union that creates new barriers against non-EU NATO allies. Open trade, competition, innovation, also in defense domain, will strengthen our economies.
So you say the EU should treat us on equal measure. It would be a mistake if the fact that we're not members of the EU, we cannot partake in these programs to that extent.
Yes, that's my general rule. Of course, there will always be some difference between EU members and non-EU members, for instance, some of the decision-making. And I also understand there are some challenges related to some of the joint financing. So I'm not saying it has to be 100% equal, but we should look into the details of some of these programs and make sure we don't create new barriers. That will be bad for non-EU allies, but also for EU allies. We need to work together. And again, going back to the Cold War, we won because we believed in free trade, open economies. We should not now start to close our economies. That will undermine the competitiveness both on the defense industry but also industry in general.
I would like to ask the Polish minister a question, but just to close this, Mr. Stoltenberg, you said there's other countries like the UK and Iceland and Norway. Maybe we see politics differently. But in Iceland, the conversation about joining the EU has really changed over the past year.
No.
Do you detect that the same in Norway, or actually you'd say it hasn't, and we just need to come to terms?
No, absolutely. There is a new government or a relatively new government, government in Iceland. It's not so new anymore, but they have been very clear that they want a referendum on applying for EU membership. And as a strong supporter and believer in the European Union, I will of course welcome if they move forward on that path. But again, one thing is a government that wants a referendum, another thing is to win the referendum, and then to negotiate an accession treaty that works. Just to share with you, we have the European Economic Area, where we have three countries, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, in what we call the EFTA pillar, which is fully integrated into the European internal market. So we have all the directives, all the regulations which apply for the internal market in EU, applies also for Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. And then I would say that I would have preferred that we have been full members of the European Union. The only thing I like with this EFTA pillar in the EEA agreement is that the EFTA pillar with Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, that's the only international institution where Norway is a superpower. But I would like to join the EU.
Okay. Okay.
And it would be all much easier, Jens, with Norway being member of Norway. This morning we were discussing some trade measures, some discussion about that there are some issues, and it would be really good with Norway sitting at the table in Brussels.
Well, that's good to hear. On this risk consensus, Minister, there's another question that we heard yesterday on day one with a lot of these European companies who say, if it's European money that's going to be put on the table, and to be fair, we are paying. So this is not a gift. This is coming from European money. This should go to European companies, and there should be a clear European preference. This money has to go into European companies. Do you agree with that premise? And what is the issue? Is it the lack of funding, or is there a question of you just don't have the institutional framework? Joint procurement is nice, but the industry is still very fragmented in Europe. What is the issue to achieve this European preference if you support it?
Sure, of course, that's Poland is in a very specific situation. We need that equipment now. Yes, we are not ready to wait 10, 15 years for the whole development of the European defense industry. Having said that, of course, that, as I said a moment ago, building strong Polish, strong European defense industry is our core goal. It's our top priority. We need strong European defense industry, and this is why, of course, in the SAFE you have preferences for buying European and for buying together, because buying together puts average price down. So that's our position. Having said that, of course, we need to buy a lot of equipment right now.
So just so we understand, for you, it would be more a question of, I care more about the velocity of the delivery at this point than the origin of the weapon.
We need to think about both, right? Poland is in a very specific position, geographical position. So as I said, we just cannot wait 15 years for development of some technologies. But of course, as a Minister of Finance of Poland, for me, it's always better to buy Polish products. Then, of course, I want to strengthen the European economy, where we have our closest economical relations. But we need equipment now.
Mr. Stoltenberg, your country is very specifically or very particular because you have a massive wealth fund, which is a beast. I mean, this is a huge moneymaker. Some believe when we talk about funding, it really should be all hands on deck and everyone should get involved. Do you see a bigger role for this wealth fund into defense? It takes a change of mentality in some way, because back in the day, investing in defense had a negative connotation, certainly in Europe. Do you see that changing, and do you believe, yes, it is all hands on deck, and that should include the fund?
Well, I think we need to distinguish. The fund is a broad index fund where we follow international markets, and we will continue to do so, also investing in defense industry. But that's a way to minimize risk and to maximize returns, to not be a strategic fund to invest in particular companies, but to be a small owner of close to 9,000 or 8,500 companies all over the world. That will remain the strategy of the fund. But then the fund generates income to the Norwegian state. And we don't spend from the kind of original installment. We only spend the financial return from the fund. That's the beauty of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And of course, that return enables Norway to invest in many different purposes, like, for instance, defense. Meaning that we are now spending more than 3% of our GDP on defense, enabled by the return from the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I think there is hardly any other country in the world which provides more support to Ukraine measured against GDP or per capita. It's 7 billion cash from the Norwegian budgets to the euros, or a bit more actually, to military support to Ukraine. And Norway is among, I think we are now the only country in the world, together with Luxembourg actually, which provides more than 1% of GDP in development aid. So yes, the fund enables us to invest, and we will continue to do so. Let me add one more thing about the fund. Also, if you want to spend more on defense, you either need to cut other expenditures, healthcare and so on, that's difficult. Borrow, which is dangerous in the long run, because or increase taxes. I'm not give advice, but I always say that Norway, even with the returns from the oil and gas, we have higher taxes than most European countries. So that's the reason why we have the fund. because we didn't reduce taxes. We kept the taxes high. We saved the money from the oil and gas activities, and now we can use the revenues. So this is not, by luck. This is by decision enabling us to save because we kept high taxes. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's possible.
So you're saying this fund is the piggy bank, as sometimes make it out to be. We have reached the end of the session, but I have a final question. Your teams are going to kill me, but very briefly, since you mentioned, very short, since you mentioned return of investment, let me ask you a question framed like that. At the NATO summit, all of the allies agreed we would increase to 5%. It was a summit where people were very nice to President Trump. I'm not sure, Mr. Stoltenberg, if you would use that language of Mark Rutte, you're only you could have done this, Mr. President. We're so thankful. But you committed to the 5%. You tailor-made a summit for the U.S. You have accommodated every single possible thing, including the trade deal, which some argue is not balanced. All of this put together, is there a return of investment? Do you believe the U.S. will actually come to Europe's defense if that was necessary and they're committed to NATO? Was that a good investment that you made for the two of you?
Well, U.S. is our strongest and closest ally. Yes, we do believe that investing in security has a great return on ROE.
The U.S. specifically.
Yeah, but as I said seconds ago, we want a strong European defense industry. We need capabilities here. We need capacities here. So I believe that there is no any contradiction between those two. And of course, that trade deal with U.S. was difficult. Let me phrase it this
Triple
way.
Tariffs.
But we are happy. We are happy that more and more European partners are declaring that they will increase their spending on defense, also because of this NATO summit.
Mr. Stoltenberg, obviously you have a personal history too. Do you think the U.S. is really committed to NATO after all of this accommodation that was made?
Well, I just published a book which actually describes all of this in detail and my assessments. That's 400 pages, so you can read it and then you will see my thorough assessment of that. But let me just say on defense spending and whether it is an investment with the expected returns. I would say that increased defense spending is the right medicine regardless of the diagnosis you believe in. Meaning it's a no-regret strategy. Because either you believe that the US will stay committed to NATO, then it's right to invest in increased defense because it increases the likelihood for US to stay and it strengthens the totality of NATO. So if you believe that the US may stay, then you should invest more in defense.
But do you believe it?
Yeah, but then I believe it. But second, even if you don't believe it, it's even more important to invest in European defense. So whatever you believe in, invest in defense. That's the short answer.
So Poland, with no doubt, is right now the best place to invest in Europe. And this is not only because we have this very strong economy with GDP growing about 3.5%, but it's also because we right now have the third strongest army in NATO. So you can feel secure while investing in our country. And this is why this investment is such a good return.
But don't tell the Norwegian Minister of Defense that I promised more money for defense because he's sitting there and he will have all the money.
There you go, sir. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, both of you.
I'm so sorry we went longer, but it was excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stay in the room because we will continue with the second part of the session. And now, if you allow me, I would like to bring on stage Beata Javorcik, who is the chief economist for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Thank you very much. Mikołaj Raczyński, he is the Vice President of the Management Board of the Polish Fund for Development. Thank you very much. And then, of course, Hristo Stoykov, who is the Director and Head of the Defense and Security Office at the European Investment Bank. So thanks for staying with us in this panel. There will be questions from the audience at the end, so I will be very fast with my questions. Obviously, we just heard from the two ministers. They talked about the synergies between defense and security. So I wonder, the implications of spending more in defense, what will that do to the economy? And what are the implications also for the dynamics of this economy? Because they also talked about difficult choices that will have to be made. Perhaps with you.
So thank you for the invitation. A pleasure to be here. I think we have to be incredibly smart about how the money on defense is being spent. And there are some obvious trade-offs. Let me mention three. The first one is the trade-off between spending money on core defense versus more broadly defined resilience. So think about resilient infrastructure, cybersecurity, or renewables, which are part of energy security. And that's because anything that's spent on broadly defined defense is going to help stimulate growth, because infrastructure and cybersecurity, these are all issues that matter for the private sector. And actually, since the global financial crisis, we have seen a decline in investment to GDP in this part of the world. That's not something that happened in other parts of the world, so anything that fuels investment is welcome. The second trade-off is between getting equipment fast and buying it locally. We just heard the minister talking about it. Of course, buying locally stimulates growth. The third, and perhaps the most important trade-off, is between buying the best defense systems available today versus developing the best defense systems of tomorrow, right? So it's about how much of that money we are going to spend on research and development. And that matters because that's our best bet when it comes to laying foundations for future growth. Let me give you a very telling statistic. When you look at the list of 2,000 companies with largest R&D spending globally, a third of them is American, a quarter is Chinese, only a fifth is European. 20 years ago, that list was dominated by European companies. So unless we increase expenditure on R&D, we are risking falling further behind the US and China catching up. So, that brings us back to the Draghi report, which was published a year ago, and which said we need to take action in order to preserve our quality of life. And because no such big amounts of money will be available in the near future, we need to make sure that defense spending helps lay foundation for future growth.
And you say also because that amount of money is not going to be available soon. Some argue, however, and I don't want to get into political debate, but some argue the issue in Europe is not money. Europe is a rich continent. There are ways to invest if you believe this is the right way to do it. The problem is that the diagnosis of the situation is still very fragmented. If you ask a German and a French, what is your view on this, they will give you two different answers. So is there a way that this can be put together? I mean, what is the end game that would achieve a form of consensus for Europeans?
Well, I think we need to pursue multiple strategies, right? One is an EU strategy of savings and investment union, which, as the hope is, will make sure that the ideas that are created in Europe will be funded in Europe. But the complementary strategy is to do more on venture capital front. I mean, if you look at the data, Estonia is the only country in this part of the world which has actually substantial venture capital investment relative to GDP. So that's something that national governments can do, and that's something that they could do relatively fast.
And of course, a follow-up question we heard from your minister, who said you should really invest in Poland because we're going to be the biggest army in NATO. We're growing much faster than the European average. But what is your pitch, not just specifically to the country, but also the projects that you're interested in? Where do you see a form of real business synergy? Because one of the things that to me is obvious in this conference after is that you can talk about defense all you want, but if there's no business case scenario behind it, it's going to be very difficult to carry it to fruition.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that the very important point is what Beata mentioned before, Minister Domański, is that we need equipment now. So it's obvious reason that we don't have a European industry in defense very developed. But what we see now is a strong initial signal, initial strategic push from the governments that, okay, right now we are buying from foreign nations, and it's not a surprise that we are buying from Israeli, US, and South Korea because of these reasons. But what should be the broad government strategy around it is try to build something around that spending. And what Beata mentioned is the, for example, venture capital industry. Also in Israel, very robust defense technology sector. So, for example, what we are trying to do as a Polish Development Fund, we just launched a PFR Deep Tech Fund, which we are going to commit funds, our resources, to VC, venture capital funds, working in Poland, in the region, trying to support dual-use defense tech technologies. So that's our initial push as a state-owned company, as a development institution. So around the defense spending, which is happening around Europe, is very high in Poland. And actually Poland and Polish startups has a very unique opportunity because being closest to Ukraine conflict, so many Ukrainian people being here, an opportunity to maybe try some of the new technology just very close to the conflict, try to talk to Ukrainian military, give a big advantage, a big edge in developing the defense tech industry in Poland. That's one of the areas we believe defense tech is also a direction for investments going into Poland and into the region.
And it's very interesting you say that. I was here last year, and at the time, what people were very interested in was the air defense. That was the big talker last year. This year, funnily enough, everyone that I've asked that question, what's the #1 item that you're interested in this year? A lot of them have said drones. That's the start of the show this year. What projects are you interested? Now that you mentioned we can learn from the Ukrainians, they're very good at that now. What is it that you're interested in terms of what could be developed that's needed, but also good business?
I think it's more of the private sector role, which projects to choose. From year to year, we see different ones. This year, we are also opening the EDA bootcamp, which will be focusing on space and cybersecurity. But I think the right way to approach this is try to mix the public finance or the public source of funding and the private sector, which knows and put their money on technologies which they think will be in 2, 3, 5, 7 year times as in a VC needed for the conflict. This year is drones, cybersecurity, air defense, satellites. Those are the sectors which I think will develop over the years. And maybe last sentence, because Silicon Valley in the US, how it was created at the beginning. It was at the grounds of the Vietnam War. The technology sector in Israel also based on some defense spending. So we have an opportunity to create some VC space around defense tech in Poland based on the European defense spending and conflict in Ukraine.
Well, thank you for that. And of course now, just to perhaps reset and go back to the initial title, at the European Investment Bank for a long time, you could do a lot of dual use. That was acceptable. There's a big debate as to whether just specific defense should be added into some of your duties. But the EIB was seen as almost a very social green institutions for a while. Now there's a big push to make it a defense bank. How do you do both? Can you do both? And ultimately, is there going to be a trade-off? If you say the economy, the way we understood it before Ukraine, will not look like the war that we won't have now, but also in 5 years, things have changed fully.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the question, Maria. You're absolutely right. The European Investment Bank is a very distinct multilateral institution. We're owned by the 27 member states, and in that respect, we are the only vehicle that Europe has to have a common approach towards financing of common goods. And yes, for like more than 60 years, we've been investing in green. 60% of our 100 billion euro per year investment go in green, social, innovation. Now, 2 years ago, you would not have someone like me sitting here with the title Director of Security and Defense Office of the European Investment Bank. It will sound ludicrous. But the times have changed, and our governments and our shareholders have spoken to the board, through the board and through the European Council, and our president, Nadia Calvino, has responded very strongly. So a year and a half ago, the European Investment Bank set up the Security and Defense Office, first of its kind of multi-purpose experts, to look how we can engage in the industry, but without creating this zero-sum game dynamic. So when we lend 100 billion euros per year, usually it's not black and white. It's not like we're going to stop investing in social housing, or we're going to stop investing in innovation and put money in defense. What we did is, in fact, we did a market study across Europe, and we tried to identify where are the pain points of the European industry, and there are a few that we identified. First one is the supply chain of our large prime contractors. So the primes in Europe are much smaller than the American ones. They're very inefficient in the way that we distribute between different platforms, their R&D budgets and so forth. And they all rely on thousands of SMEs to produce what they need to produce. So Leonardo has 3,500 SMEs supplying them. Rheinmetall has more. Airbus has 3 times more. They rely on 10,000 SMEs. The first thing we created was a program that will help SMEs to scale up their production and their supply chain, to strengthen the supply chain and their working capital. That, we believe, will have a wider effect over the economy, and it will create also a pull effect for private capital. We just signed a large agreement with Deutsche Bank in Germany and Banque Populaire Caisse d'Épargne in France, whereby through our guarantees and investments, and these private banks will be able to support thousands of SMEs that are suppliers to the European defense contractors. So in that respect, in this way, we achieve 2 things. Like, first of all, we help SMEs grow in Europe, which is the cornerstone of the European economy. And second, we work together towards a common strategy to boost the European defense industry. The second thing we looked at is common goods. Galileo is one example. Iris Square is coming. In Poland, for example, last year we financed also co-financed with the government satellite systems for observation, and these are more and more being discussed as common European goods. So we are engaging actively with the European Space Agency and the European Commission to look at what kind of assets we need to develop as Europeans and benefit both the economy and the European society. So this could be military mobility, airlift, this could be communication, this could be also observation from space, and these are things that we're looking at. The third thing is, and it was mentioned already, the venture capital system. So we are the largest investor in the European VC ecosystem. We are an investor in 60% of all the European VC funds through our subsidiary, the European Investment Fund. What we did last year is we tested for the first time a program with the European Defense Agency whereby we try to create fund managers that are specialized in security and defense. They did not exist in Europe. It was extremely hard to find management teams that are aware of the dynamics technologically, financially, but also geopolitically and legally, how you deal with this industry. Now we have already 6 funds signed. It's been 1 year, but we see more and more coming in. And overall, with these activities in the last 1 year, we managed to push 3.5 billion euros into European defense from pretty much from zero. Yes, we had dual use. And next year, we're planning to increase it. Last point is the social investment. So we just heard, like, we are democracies, and having strong economies also keep the democracies safe, and they can be protected against different hybrid threats. So investing in a smart way in defense infrastructure is something that we're focusing on. And I'll give you an example. We got approached by large and smaller European armies, and they were asking us, how can we help with, for example, social housing for military personnel? How can we help with military mobility that is of dual-use nature? How can we bring private capital in infrastructure projects that are linked to defense? And we have put together, and you can see it on our website, the first of its kind study on European public-private partnerships in defense, where we outline 27 type of joint undertakings that we have seen over the years in Europe, mostly in UK, to be honest, that have pulled together private and public capital for the common good in a sustainable way. So I know it's a long answer, but yes, I think the EIB is looking, and I think we are finding already the right way to promote the economy, strengthen the European defense infrastructure, and push forward the agenda. So,
but just to, as a follow-up to that question, because some believe ultimately when you have to spend more in certain areas where before you would not have to spend as much, either you get more funding or it's a question of priorities have to be reallocated. So if I understand correctly, you're still saying we can still do this green push, which, you know, in Brussels, you barely hear now the idea of the Green Deal anymore. We can still continue with this while doing defense. Do you really believe you can do the two to the same capacity in this new context?
Yes, I do. And as I said, I will try to be practical in my answers. I had a few of the largest European primes coming to our team and asking us to support green transition investments. They were saying, like, we ourselves, I had a weapon manufacturer in Belgium asking us, are you interested to support our green transition? I had other primes coming and saying, like, can you help us to install a new water treatment system for our chemical processes? So they are also moving into that direction. I think there is a way to find the balance between the two. It cannot be just black and white. And we are trying to select the projects that can achieve both at the same time.
Okay, well, interesting to see how the side guys may be changing or not. But perhaps just because this conversation doesn't happen in isolation, you know, this is happening in a global context. We talked briefly about the trade deal. Well, if you can call it a deal. I know a lot of people don't want to call it a deal because they feel it was an imposition. That's what it was. You know, tariffs have tripled. There's a lot of uncertainty in the global economy. There's a real question as to how can you multiply growth accelerators in Europe. There's always a perennial question as to whether we're falling behind some of the bigger economies or not. How do you see all of this playing out while also saying we're going to pursue an aggressive policy of defense spending when there's all of this volatility around the world?
So many questions folded into one. So let me start with the trade deal with the US that was mentioned. We have just looked at what happened to exports from EBRD's regions of operations to the US. These exports have went up by 8% in the first half of this year. That's relative to the same period last year. But the performance was uneven. So Hungary managed to increase quite significantly its exports of medication and computers. In contrast, Slovenia saw a decline in exports on the order of $830 million. That's more than 1% of its GDP. So far, the tariffs have not had a bite yet because this increase in export was driven by front-loading. Everybody wanted to get goods into the US before tariffs took an effect. So what we are going to see is actually the implications of tariffs happening later this year. Now, that's just one part of sort of global picture. Now, the good news is that tariffs faced in the US by European economies are lower than tariffs faced in China. And we have already seen that in some products, US imports from China dropped, but they increased from emerging Europe. So that's good news. But of course, the situation is quite dynamic. The US is still in conversation with China.
Can I just briefly, because you say that, I know we have to finish soon, but you said relative to other jurisdictions, the Europeans can stay competitive even in this scenario. This is what the Commission says. If you compare it to the UK, if you compare it to Japan, if you compare it to China, yes, tariffs have tripled, but on a relative basis, we're still going to stay competitive, and that mattered. Is that something that you believe, and that could that cushion perhaps some of the worst case scenario?
Well, so if you just look at number of products that were exported to the US, what you see is that about 60% of products exported from Europe faced a tariff above 5% when exported to the US. And that's right before the tariff taking a full effect. In contrast, products exported from Mexico, it was only, I think, about a fifth that was facing a similar tariff. So yes, the deal Europe got is much better than the deal that China got. But of course, you know, Canada and Mexico continue to be in privileged position. And of course, we are seeing big changes in the structure of US imports. So imports from China are going down, while imports from Vietnam, Mexico, other Asian countries are going up.
There's a question I want to ask you about deficits, but maybe we could do it after. I do want to open the floor for questions. If anyone has a question, then you could just put your hand up and present your question. So if there's one, this is now the time to do it.
Do you mind if I throw a cat at these pigeons that we have at this conference? We've got about 3 years left of Mr. Trump. Assuming that we'd have 8 years of Mr. Vance, Europe has about 10, 11 years, essentially to replace Americans in Europe as a fighting force. So that's the scenario, a window of opportunity. Now, I think people more or less realize that there is this window of opportunity and are prepared to throw resources at it. As you see, European Fund, we tend to make money available. For what? We have no idea as to what is actually to be forged as the European force capable of replacing Americans, that glue that holds NATO together. We don't have that glue in Europe. It's not a question of technology. It's much more complex than that, but largely to do with leadership, command structures, and so on, IT, and you name it. But there is a lot of talk about technology, technology transfers, technology multipliers. So you have a force with a force multipliers. But where do you get the force from? The vulnerability is people. My generation, baby boomers, is fading away.
But sir, just because we're running out of time, what is specifically the question?
No, the point is...
It's a point, okay.
How do you forge that force, throwing resources that we have in Europe, given that vulnerability that the generation that is now coming doesn't want to fight?
Well, we'll see if the new generation wants to fight. Maybe they disagree. But, you know, to be honest, the question that he's saying, you could argue it's a form of, let's take the Draghi report, which in some ways talks about this aspiration and what's the end game. You know, we could talk about the percentage that has been implemented, but some argue we should have been much more ambitious the past year. So how do you accelerate that? And as the gentleman said, how do you drive this politically too, I guess?
Well, we have just recently looked at political preferences of voters of various ages, and societies, including in Europe, are aging very quickly. And actually, in this part of Europe, we are getting old before we are getting rich, meaning we are aging at a level of GDP per capita that is lower than the point at which advanced economies age. And what you see is that older voters are much more interested in defense, much more willing to support expenditure in defense, rather than, for instance, expenditure in education. So there is this trade-off between sort of focusing on now rather than investing in the future.
You want to...
Yeah, maybe just to answer the gentleman. I've been having similar speeches at universities in Europe as well, and I cannot agree with the statement that the young people are not engaged in this conflict. But I think they're engaged in a different way. People have to have something to fight for, and I think if we can manage to achieve this economic resilience that I was just talking about, if we manage to focus their mind on quantum, on the things in the future, like quantum sensing, quantum technologies, AI, and so forth, we will be able to have a much more coherent, educated, capable society, which eventually will win the war of minds, because we are democracies. So democracies cannot fight prolonged wars against autocratic regimes. The only way you can fight such wars is if you have strong economy, and if you have people who are willing to fight for this thing. And I think through investments in social housing, through investments in education, through investments in research and development and economic base, eventually we'll achieve that. And not only, but also through investment jointly in these things. So I'm a strong believer in the European project, and Airbus is an example that when we put together resources, we can be a world leader. Now, would we have Airbus of defense, like through MBDA and the likes? It's to be seen. But I think eventually the economic logic will prevail. And yes, maybe baby boomers have something to fight for, but I would say the people who are educated today in Europe and use the Erasmus system and live in different countries, they feel much more European than the nations in the past. So I think the dynamics are different, but not the motivation. I think the motivation is there. I've seen it around.
But some actually say that reflects a form of intergenerational pessimism. You know, if you have young Europeans who, on top of that, you say, "Are you willing to die for something?" They would say, "I can't even buy a house." So what are we sort of debating? I mean, that reflects also what is seen as an intergenerational balance that is no longer working. I don't want to make this now about demographics, but you know, that is a point that was recently made up by the French government. There's a disparity and a form of generational pessimism that's sort of entrenched because of the economics behind it.
Well, the young generation realizes that they will be saddled with the debt that we are accumulating now and that we have been accumulating since COVID and through the energy shock, now defense. And, you know, as Minister Domański said, right, this debt will have to be paid off. And, you know, at the moment, emerging Europe is borrowing roughly at the same rate as France. But the cost of servicing public debt is becoming non-negligible. You know, it's 4% of GDP in Hungary, it's 2% in Poland and Romania. And should there be any turbulence in the financial markets, this cost is going to go up.
If there's time for another final question, this is the moment to put up your hand up if you have a question. If not, Beata, I'm going to ask you in this final 3 minutes, how much do you worry about the idea, going back to what you said, market volatility can happen very quickly and markets can turn into a country very fast. How much do you worry about debt and deficit at this point? And the minister also said it. Debt, whether it's for a good reason or a bad reason, is still debt.
So one needs to worry in the sort of global context, right? If you look at the US debt to GDP, it is at the level we last saw after end of World War II. All governments are taking on debt, and as we have seen in France, the discussion about reining in the debt is incredibly difficult. So, you know, the cause for optimism is the fact that, you know, EU still has some mechanisms to discipline national governments. It's incredibly difficult for any government to commit to austerity. You know, we have seen some negative implications of austerity. So that's what gives me hope. But of course, you know, we also need to remember the broader context, the context of incredible uncertainty. We have uncertainty about trade policy. If you look at indices, highest we've had in a quarter of century. If you look at uncertainty about economic policy, it's the same. We have uncertainty about the war. And uncertainty kills investment, both domestic investment, both foreign investment. So therefore, it's imperative that if we are talking here about spending for defense, we need to use that spending to invest and to invest in the future.
I know you wanted to add a quick
word. One quick thing to mention about the debt is that we measure the debt against the GDP. So the important part is if we're investing right now, getting more deficit into defense, it's because we want to defend the second part of the equation, the GDP, if something happens. So we always need to look at it from two angles.
So just finally, because we have 2 minutes left, unless there's a final question, I would like to end the way that I always do in this conference. If we start from today until next year when we're back in Warsaw for this conference, what would you like to see? What is the one item that you say next year, I hope we're talking about this or have achieved this? Perhaps we can, Mr. Stoykov, with you.
Very quickly, I think next year I would like to already speak about European projects of common interest. It is a notion that has been around, but it was never put in place. I want to see the first such European project of common interest, being the Eastern Shield, being a joint observation satellite constellation, being a joint military mobility infrastructure. But I think it's now high time that we start actually acting upon this thing.
So that's your number one.
Yes.
Many would agree. Perhaps, Beata, with you, if we can just...
I hope that we will be talking about increase in R&D spending, either concrete or planned. And I hope that our ambition is to have companies from the region, including from Poland, on that list of top 2,000 companies with highest R&D spending globally.
So if you say in the next 12 months, that's where the focus should be. I know there's a lot,
R&D
but number
spending,
one.
there is a long way to get on that list, but what matters is the trajectory.
So that's what you would like to see. And just finally, Mikhail, just...
More private capital willing to invest in Polish or European defense tech. It's not just PFR, not the BRD, but the private money willing to invest. It will be a sign that the market is getting stronger and getting more strength.
We got to go, but I have to ask you that because this was said last year also. So I need to know what has changed. Is it getting better? Do you see a form of deadlock that's finally managed to go through? Because this was said last year, so I want to know what happened.
Yesterday, we announced the first fund from PFR Deep Tech, which the PFR invests only a small portion of the fund, and we will see more private money into the fund, and more funds will come later this year.
You've noticed a switch for the better.
Yes,
It just needs to be
definitely.
faster.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Well, we have reached the end of the session. Thank you very much. Thank you to the three of you for taking all of these questions. Thank you, of course, the gentleman and his very good point, and to all of you for being with us for this hour. Thank you very much.